Hello and welcome to Crowdoscope's podcast series on collective intelligence. Today we are joined by Geoff Mulgan, who is CEO of Nesta, the UK's leading innovation foundation. Geoff has a strong background in government and policy work, has helped set up several companies and has been a visiting professor at several universities. He's recently published his new book called Big Mind: How Collective Intelligence Can Change Our World. So Geoff, how did you get into the field of collective intelligence? What triggered your interest initially?
Well, my career has taken me to thinking about thought at large scale through quite a few angles. I've got a PhD in telecoms, originally from MIT, so I've always been fascinated by how networks work and seeing the spread of the internet in all its many forms. And I worked in government in charge of strategy here in the UK and with many governments around the world, trying to get them to think more coherently, more long-term, mobilizing different sources of knowledge, whether from data or businesses or citizens. And the more my career evolved, the more it became clear to me there was almost a missing discipline, a missing way of looking at things, which was about intelligence as a topic. Mm-hmm. A huge amount of work going on artificial intelligence and machine intelligence and computing intelligence, which is fascinating, and I'm fairly involved in that both as an investor and through research projects here at Nesta. Mm-hmm. But often that was not connected to the question of how do you get people to think at large scale? How do you get a whole system, whether a health system or an education system or a sector like construction? How do we think about them almost by analogy with the human brain? And what are the opportunities of this century for making them think more effectively? Mm-hmm. And I guess the biggest prompt of all for me was a few years ago when someone pointed out to me the rather obvious point that in many ways, as our machines have got smarter, our smartphones, our laptops and so on, often the systems which matter most to us seem to be getting dumber and sometimes throw out really stupid results, or particular businesses I've worked with in the past, which often had the cleverest people and had invested most in computing, nevertheless made often the dumbest strategic decisions. And I wanted to find a theory, a framework for making sense of that paradox.
And is that how you then made the decision to write a book? So you've recently published your book, Big Mind: How Collective Intelligence Can Change Our World. Is that where this idea came from, to bring everything together, all your experience, all your thoughts?
Well, Big Mind is an attempt at bringing together a lot of different work from many different disciplines, from computing, data science, but also psychology, economics and so on, to make sense of both what is happening in terms of collective intelligence, but also what is possible. And that also draws on my own experience. What I hope it will do is prove useful to people who are responsible for orchestrating thought in a big business or a sector or a government, and helping them think about all the resources they could be tapping. Mm-hmm. And I guess the basic premise of the book is that almost anyone in the world today could be more effective if they can tap into a bigger mind, can tap into more sources of data and computing power, yes, but also more sources of insight from their employees, their collaborators, their customers and citizens. And the big question is, how do you do that in practice? Mm-hmm. And what I've tried to do in the book is set out a way of thinking about that task, which breaks it down into different elements. How do you observe? How do you develop models? How do you create? How do you remember? How do you judge? Shows where technology is changing the ways we can do each of those discrete things. But then the crucial question is, how do you then bring that together to help your business, or your sector, or your government to think more smartly through changing environments, where the methods of thought which might work in one era may not work anymore once the environment has changed. And one of the fascinating things I found again and again is how many organizations could optimize thought in one framework, but then didn't have the resources and the methods to help them generate new categories, new models when the environment changed. We saw that on a massive scale in finance in the last decade. We've seen it again and again in different businesses, particularly the most successful ones. They optimize a certain frame and then completely fail to adapt when the conditions change. And for me, a Big Mind is both about being fantastic at gathering data, analysing it and so on, but it's also about the cultivation of judgment and wisdom as well, which is what you really need to thrive over the long term.
Yeah, very, very interesting. As you mentioned, you cover quite a few areas how collective intelligence can be used in organizations, in governments, in universities, and in societies in general. Where do you see the biggest potential for collective intelligence to have an impact?
Well, I think my hope is that collective intelligence becomes a way of thinking about pretty much anything any organisation does, or any society or any economy, that this becomes part of the common sense of the 21st century, that we always look at any topic through the lens of cognition, of thought. Mm-hmm. What are its sources of data, its ways of observing? What are the models it has for making sense of the world and how our actions might have effects? How do we remember well? How do we create well? All of these tasks, I think, are relevant in almost any field. They're obviously particularly relevant in businesses, and particularly businesses dealing with complex challenges. Lots of businesses now are investing a great deal in AI tools and big data tools and small data tools and so on. I think for them the biggest risk is that they overemphasize the hardware and the tech tools and fail to integrate them with the human element and the human intelligence of their people, their customers, etc. And that's a big imbalance I see again and again in my dealings with business. There are other institutions like universities which should be right at the heart of thinking about thought. That's what they exist for. But I argue in the book they've been surprisingly slow in many ways to apply new tools of thought to their own work, which is very, very traditionally stuck in lectures and classrooms and PhDs and degrees. And I think there's many ways the university could be completely revolutionised in the next few years. There are fields like democracy, which hasn't changed that much in its main methods since the 19th century, with elected representatives sitting in Congress or Parliament. And we've shown in practice through new collective intelligence tools how those can enhance the work of democracy, bringing in the expertise of thousands of citizens or their views into very structured conversations which help take the democracy or the parliament to smarter decisions, not just referendums where you vote yes or no, but much more deliberative, thoughtful investigation of possibilities, options, facts, and so on. And of course, in the world of individual sectors, I think there's huge scope for orchestrating intelligence more effectively. I write in the book about everything from what that means for perhaps car repairs in a town, to a field like construction, to fields like advanced healthcare. In all of these fields, the curation and orchestration of intelligence can be done in ways which were almost unthinkable even 10, 15 years ago, in terms of pooling data, analysis, foresight, judgment, creativity, and so on. And that's one of the great questions of the next few years, is who's going to lead in that task? Not just applying data more intensively to analysing customer preferences, or, as with Facebook, targeting advertising, but actually using some of those tools to answer the big questions about what business should be doing and how it should be doing it.
Yeah, that brings me to my next question. Now that you mentioned creativity, you say in that chapter about how businesses can use collective intelligence that every aspect of intelligence can be done well or badly. And you mentioned creativity in organizations, and you also mentioned memory, knowledge management technologies. Can you tell our audience a little bit more how they can do intelligence well in their organizations? What does it mean in practical terms?
Well, just taking creativity for a start. Creativity has been difficult for computers to do, though there are some intriguing AI tools now for generating new visual artworks or pieces of music and so on. They're still not really at the level that we would probably want to pay too much for. But I think we shouldn't underestimate how much computing power will enhance creativity. The surprising thing in business, though, is that much of what is done around creativity doesn't draw very much from what's been learned over 50 or 60 years. So, for example, there's been reams and reams of evidence about how ineffective brainstorms are a way of generating ideas, and yet most businesses run brainstorms pretty much the same way they were done in the 70s, 60s, 50s, despite lots of evidence. That's a pretty bad way of generating novel new ideas. I have a whole chapter in the book about meetings, And although some companies have been very imaginative in how they run meetings, so Amazon, for example, often has the beginnings of meetings in silence while people read written papers on the topic, and some other companies have required meetings to be no more than 10 or 15 minutes long. A huge proportion of the meetings in business are really badly run, ignore all the evidence and science about what makes meetings good. I'd say most business conferences are completely hopeless as a way of orchestrating the collective intelligence of the people in the room. So hopefully even that chapter alone provides some useful pointers to anyone wanting to use valuable time more effectively. And then there's a host of new technology tools for organising creativity which allow you to tap into brain power far beyond your own organisation. We run one at Nesta called challenges.org, which posts particular challenges, for example, for Toyota on new ways of organising mobility, for the US government on data-driven farming. And these are all ways of tapping into a community of innovators all over the world who you may never have met, and then providing them with rewards for coming up with useful solutions. And this is just one of a host of new innovations in innovation, which are essentially about harvesting collective intelligence in new ways. And my hope is that through, say, books like this and really the development of a field of practice of collective intelligence, we can help organisations better tell the difference between what's sort of BS, what's just hype, and what are real tools which help them solve problems more effectively and not waste their time.
Mm-hmm. And what about memory and knowledge management in organisations?
Knowledge management is a nightmare for many organisations. In theory, in the age of Google search, you should be able to find any memory which matters. But I think every organisation, particularly big ones, really struggle with orchestrating their own memory. Later this week, we are publishing at Nesta a report I commissioned on how to organise memory in governments more effectively. Mm-hmm. And it comes up with some very, in some ways, simple solutions about how to tag everything, about never using PDFs, doing shared document creation as a matter of course, and building in say searchability to almost everything which is done. Now these are quite cheap tools. They're quite threatening, though, in terms of internal organisational culture, but our premise is that governments at least should be organising their memory much more effectively and not doing what we see all the time, which is repeating unnecessary mistakes, doing projects and not being able to find the person who did the similar project 10, 15, 20 years ago. And I know most large businesses struggle with exactly the same problems. And as always with these things, it's partly a technical question. How do you design in the underlying structures of data so you can capture and retrieve memory? But it's also about human beings and culture and willingness to share and trust and collaborate. And if you only see it as a technical problem, as so many in knowledge management have done, you end up with systems which don't work. And again, this reinforces why we need new, really hybrid disciplines which combine the technology, the hardware, the software with the human element and the psychology of collaboration, the psychology of organising memory, because otherwise all experience shows that the solutions don't quite work.
Mm-hmm. So if an organisation were to introduce new technologies to manage knowledge management more effectively, for instance, what would be your advice for them to tackle the human side, to change the culture of how knowledge is being shared on a more horizontal level, for instance? Do you have any suggestions for our audience how they could try and get that collective intelligence thinking, the whole framework that you mentioned, how they could get this ball rolling?
Well, the question of how you make a whole organisation feel like a genuine collective, so people as a matter of course are willing to share insights and knowledge and data and contacts, that is a highly sort of social question. In the book I show how much has been learnt about the creation of that feeling of collectiveness and common identity. It partly comes out of experiences, shared experiences. It partly comes out of codes. It comes often out of face-to-face interactions. It's very hard online alone to create that sense of community and we-ness. And that can all then be reinforced by incentive structures. So in appraisals and payment systems, you do actually reward collaboration and sharing and try to penalise people who are too selfish or siloed in their behaviours. But there is no simple formula to how you make a very large organisation good at horizontal sharing. It is that combination of many elements of culture psychology and underlying technology design which captures data, captures experiences, and also a crucial thing, ensures that at the end of any project or program of any kind, you are systematically capturing the learning, getting the people who've been involved in an honest way to take stock of what worked and what didn't work. And one strand of the book is very much about that human element, what we've learned about teams and what makes really good teams work. And I argue that all the truly fantastic teams in sports or music or science or business manage to create this dynamic where they're willing to be very critical of each other, very rigorous and honest in admitting when things haven't worked or have worked, but within a context of very strong mutual commitment. I call this an autonomous commons, which is perhaps a slightly sort of pompous way of describing how you create a space within the team or the organisation where you can honestly look at the facts, free from ego, free from interest, free from sort of the play of incentives. And that turns out to be critical for any truly excellent team. And perhaps one of the most important tasks of leadership is how to keep cultivating and renewing that culture of often brutal honesty and rigour, making sense of the things which have worked and the things which haven't.
Wonderful, thank you. So what are your hopes and expectations for the future of the field of collective intelligence?
At the moment, we're seeing enormous investment in artificial intelligence, some of it from my own organisation, I should say. Billions is being invested by private investors, by governments from China, US, UK and so on, and that's all to the good. By comparison, the collective intelligence field is very underinvested, has very few and very small centres around the world trying to make sense of how it works. My big hope for the next 10 years is that imbalance is slightly rectified, and we create a number of seriously resourced centres of collective intelligence, both within businesses and within universities and perhaps governments too, around the world, which gather really the sort of the underlying elements and knowledge we need to create a discipline. Here at Nesta this spring we're launching one part of this, which is our own Centre for Collective Intelligence Design, where we're going to be particularly focused on the practical skills. How do you design meetings? How do you design platforms which can tap knowledge from all over the world? What have we learnt about the interplay of AI and collective intelligence in fields like health or education or small businesses? And we will be running experiments around the world, often using randomised controlled trials. We'll be trying to systematise what is being learnt, and we'll be doing our own training for organisations which are wanting to do this better. The analogy which I use is with, it's two analogies from the 20th century. One was cities. So about 100 years ago, it became clear that to get cities to work well, you couldn't just have the expertise of architects and construction engineers and road builders. You needed an urban planning discipline, which was a kind of hybrid discipline which brought those together and helped people design and plan and run cities well. And if that hadn't happened, our cities would be even more perhaps nightmares than they are today. The urban planning profession, when it worked well, was able to make cities cohere, flow, make them livable places, and again get the hardware and the human elements in sync. About 50, 60 years ago, the business schools were again the creation of a hybrid discipline of business studies, which came out of many other elements like, again, economics, psychology, organizational design, to create a hybrid field which could be then useful to businesses wanting to make sense of strategy and marketing and finance. I see collective intelligence now as very similar to those past efforts in needing to create a new hybrid discipline which can pull together the best of psychology, computer science, etc., but into a useful discipline, which is why we're focusing on the word design. How do you design intelligent systems at the level of a large company? It could be an Amazon or a Google, to help a city to think more effectively about solving its own problems, which could be improving air quality, or a project we're working on here at Nesta, how to use drones in cities in the next 5 or 10 years in ways which make sense both for the economy and for the citizens of a city. And at the moment there are no centres really doing that anywhere in the world. None in business, none in universities, etc. Our hope is we will help support a network of centres which become really good at this task of intelligence design, and if that does happen well, then there'll be knock-on benefits for pretty much every sector of the economy, but above all perhaps for our societies, where we will see not just a proliferation of smart objects, sensors, phones, you name it, Amazon, Alexa, Echoes in our homes, but also we'll feel that the systems which guide our lives, which shape our lives, systems of healthcare or transport or policing and so on, actually are as smart as the societies which they're serving. And too often at the moment, I think people feel the systems are less smart than the people and the technologies, and that's an imbalance we need to bridge.
Very interesting. Thank you very much. So where can we find out more about your centre? Is it on Nesta, or do you have a specific homepage to find out more about this?
We will be launching formally our new centre in May this year, and there'll be a lot of material on the Nesta website. We're going to be also curating what we think is interesting research being done around the world, interesting new tools being provided by startups all over the world. There's many already creating fantastic tools for organising collective intelligence, helping organisations to think, and we'll be hosting events, some tapping into the existing emergent academic community of researchers studying collective intelligence, but also crucially linking into the people doing it really well in businesses. So we'll have DeepMind and McKinsey and others collaborating with us on what we're learning about the combination of AI and CI, and this to me is the crucial bit. Let's carry on the momentum with new applications of machine learning and artificial intelligence, but wherever possible connect that with the human and the collective, so we get a true new field of intelligence design taking shape and hopefully changing the world for the better.
Sounds very, very exciting. Thank you very much, Geoff, for your time, and thank you for being on the show.
Thank you very much.
This was a podcast by Crowdoscope. If you'd like to know more about us or this podcast series, please get in touch and send us an email to hello@crowdoscope.com.